The cold was a physical thing, a weight that settled in a man's bones and stayed there until the spring thaw. Elias felt it in his hands as he strained the wire for the northern fence line, the metal biting into his worn leather gloves. He felt it in his chest when he breathed, a sharp, clean ache that reminded him he was alive. The wind swept down from the ridges, carrying nothing but the scent of pine and the promise of more snow. It was a lonely sound, but it was a familiar one. His ranch was a pocket of hard-won order carved into the edge of a vast, indifferent wilderness. The fences marked the border between his world and everything else. He finished cinching the wire, the muscles in his back and shoulders protesting. He stood for a moment, his breath pluming in the air, and surveyed his work. The posts were straight, the wire taut. It was good work, it was enough. He walked the line back toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. The silence of the house was different from the silence of the fields. Out here, the world was quiet but full of life. Inside, the quiet was an absence. He pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the main room. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and dark. A long wooden table, scarred and polished with age, sat in the center. It was a table built for a family, but only one chair showed signs of regular use. On the mantelpiece, next to a tarnished silver locket, sat a small wooden horse. Its paint was worn away in patches, its ears were chipped, and one of its rockers was smoother than the other from years of small hands pushing it back and forth across the floorboards. He ran a thumb over the horse's head, a ritual as ingrained as his morning coffee. The wood was smooth, almost soft. He had carved it himself one winter, long ago. A tightness formed in his chest, the familiar ghost of a pain so deep it no longer had a name. He turned away and began the motions of his evening. He built a fire, the crackle of the kindling a welcome intrusion. He put a pot of water on to boil and measured out coffee grounds, enough for one. He used to make enough for two. The memory surfaced without warning, as it often did. Sarah, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, her laughter filling the quiet spaces of the room. He pushed it down. Memory was a luxury he could not afford. He ate his meal of salted meat and hard bread standing by the counter, his gaze fixed on the blackness outside the window. This was his life, a series of tasks performed in order from sunrise to sunset. It was a wall he had built around himself, and it was just as sturdy as his fences. The next morning, the world was white. A fresh blanket of snow had fallen overnight, softening the hard edges of the landscape. It also meant checking the traps and the further fences was a necessity. He pulled on his heaviest coat, the wool coarse against his skin, and stepped outside. The air was still and frigid. As he neared the edge of his property, where the sparse woods began, he saw them. Tracks. They were not the tracks of deer or wolves. They were heavy, booted footprints, clumsy and uneven, staggering from side to side. A trespasser. His hand went to the hunting knife on his belt. He was not a man who welcomed visitors. He followed the tracks, his own steps light and sure in the snow. They led him deeper into the trees, toward a small, sheltered ravine. He found her there. She was an orc, taller than him by a head, even slumped against the trunk of a dead pine. Her skin was a pale ashen green, stretched taut over high cheekbones. A pair of short, sharp tusks jutted from her lower lip, one of them chipped at the tip. She was dressed in rags that offered little protection from the cold, and her bare hands were raw and chapped. But it was her eyes that held him. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a defiant fire that seemed to burn against the cold itself. She watched him approach, her body tense, a cornered animal ready to fight to the last. He stopped a dozen feet away, holding his hands up, palms open, to show he meant no harm. "You're on my land," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "I will be gone by morning," she rasped, her voice a dry crackle. He saw the shiver that racked her body, a tremor she tried and failed to control. He saw the feverish glaze in her eyes. "You'll be dead by morning," he stated, a simple fact. "The cabin is warm. There's food." She pushed herself away from the tree, trying to stand tall, a mockery of strength. Her pride was a brittle thing, the only armor she had left. "I don't need saving," she said, the words sharp and clear. Then her eyes rolled back in her head, her knees buckled. He moved without thinking, closing the distance in 2 long strides and catching her before she hit the ground. Her weight was shocking, both in its surprising lightness, she was starving, and in the sudden, undeniable reality of another person in his arms. A wave of heat radiated from her skin. She was burning with fever. He held her for a moment, the snow falling softly around them. The logical part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive and alone for 5 years, told him to leave her. She was not his problem. She was a risk, an unknown quantity that threatened the careful, empty peace he had constructed. Section. But the man he had been before the silence, the man who had held his wife and cradled his son, made the choice for him. He adjusted his grip, lifted her fully, and started the long walk back to the cabin. The house felt alien with her in it. He laid her on a cot he dragged near the hearth, the one he kept for the rare occasions a winter storm trapped him indoors for days. Her presence filled the room, a disturbance in the still air. He worked methodically, stripping off her wet frozen rags and wrapping her in thick wool blankets. Her skin was a roadmap of old scars and fresh wounds. On her wrist, he saw the raw, chafed mark of a manacle. A labor camp. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He knew the stories. He spent the next 2 days tending to her. He melted snow for water, boiled it, and used it to clean her cuts. He brewed a bitter tea from willow bark to fight the fever. He forced spoonfuls of thin broth between her lips when she muttered and thrashed in her delirium. She fought him even in her unconsciousness, a deep, instinctual distrust that went beyond rational thought. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. He found her awake, propped up on one elbow, her dark eyes tracking his every move. The fire was still there, but now it was banked with caution. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice stronger. "My cabin," he said, keeping his distance. He gestured to the hearth. "You collapsed. I brought you here." She looked around the room, taking in the sturdy furniture, the clean swept floor, the small wooden horse on the mantel. Her gaze lingered on the horse. Why? He did not have an answer for that, not one he could put into words. "You were freezing to death," he said simply. He ladled some thicker stew into a bowl and placed it on the floor, halfway between them. He did the same with a cup of water. Then he retreated to his own side of the room and sat at the table, turning his attention to mending a piece of leather harness. He gave her space. He could feel her watching him, weighing him. After a long silence, he heard the scrape of the bowl on the stone floor. He heard the sound of her eating, slow and deliberate. Thus began their uncomfortable cohabitation. For a week, they existed in a state of silent, watchful truce. He followed his routines, rising before dawn to tend to the livestock and check the fences. He would leave food and fresh water for her before he left. When he returned, the bowl and cup would be clean, stacked neatly by the hearth. She rarely moved from the cot, spending her days regaining her strength, her eyes following him as he moved about the cabin in the evenings. She said nothing. He asked nothing. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. He learned her name by accident. She cried out in her sleep one night, a single, sharp word. Gorza. It sounded like a name from the old mountains, a name of stone and iron. The first time she left the cot was to fetch more firewood from the pile he kept inside. He was sharpening an axe head, and he watched her out of the corner of his eye. She moved with a stiff grace, her body still weak, but possessed of an underlying power. She laid the logs by the fire without a word and returned to her spot. It was a beginning. A few days later, he came in from the barn, shaking snow from his coat, to find her standing by the stove, stirring the stew he had left simmering. She had added wild roots he recognized from the pantry, ones that added a sharp, earthy flavor. She did not look at him, but she ladled a bowl for him and set it on the table. She then served herself and sat not on the cot, but in the chair opposite him. They ate in silence. The stew was better than his. The quiet was different now. It was less of an absence and more of a shared space. As her strength returned, she began to take on small tasks around the cabin. She swept the floors. She mended one of his shirts with small, neat stitches that were far better than his own clumsy repairs. She never asked permission. She simply saw a thing that needed doing and did it. It was a language of action, a currency of competence. He found he did not mind the intrusion. The house felt less empty. The shared labor began in earnest one morning when he went out to split wood for the week. The air was biting and the work was hard. After a few minutes, he heard the cabin door open and close. Gorza came out, wrapped in one of his old coats that was too small in the shoulders for her. She did not speak. She simply picked up the second axe that leaned against the woodshed, tested its weight, and began to work on another log. Her rhythm was different from his, a powerful, efficient swing that split the seasoned pine in a single blow. He watched her for a moment, then returned to his own work. They worked side by side for over an hour, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of axes, the crack of splitting wood, and their own synchronized breaths misting in the frozen air. A partnership, unspoken and unplanned, was being forged in the cold. They fell into a new routine. They worked together during the day, maintaining the ranch. She learned to check the traps, her movements in the woods silent and sure. He showed her how to mend the leather tack for the horses, and her strong, steady hands proved adept at the task. She was a fast learner, and she possessed a deep, practical intelligence. He began to see the person beneath the survivor. He saw the way her eyes would soften when she watched the old mare in the paddock. He saw the quiet satisfaction she took in a well-stacked woodpile or a neatly repaired fence. He learned that she preferred her coffee black and that she hummed a low, tuneless melody when she was concentrating on a task. These were small things, but they were the bricks from which trust was slowly, carefully being built. One evening, a blizzard descended, trapping them inside. The wind howled around the eaves of the cabin, and snow piled up in deep drifts against the door. Inside, the fire crackled, casting a warm, flickering light over the room. Elias was oiling his rifle, the familiar scent of solvent filling the air. Gorza sat by the hearth, sharpening his skinning knife with a whetstone, her movements patient and precise. "You never asked," she said, her voice low. He stopped his work and looked at her. "Asked what?" "Where I came from, why I was out there." He set the rifle aside. "It wasn't my business to ask," he replied. "You needed help. That was all that mattered." She tested the edge of the knife with her thumb, then set it down. She stared into the flames, her face a mask of old sorrows. "It was a silver mine," she said, her voice flat. "In the northern mountains, they called us laborers. We were slaves." She told him of the cold, the darkness, the gnawing hunger. She did not speak with self-pity, but with the detached air of someone recounting a history that belonged to another person. She spoke of the guards, of their casual cruelty, and of the warden who ran the camp, a man named Cale. He enjoyed his work, she said, a bitter edge to her words. He believed we were animals. He treated us as such. She told him how she had escaped, waiting for a supply wagon and slipping away during a snowstorm just like this one. She had been running for months, surviving on what she could hunt or forage, always moving south, away from the mountains. "I have a son," she said, and the words seemed to cost her more than all the others. "His name is Kalen. When they took me, I managed to get him to my sister's clan in the foothills. I was trying to get back to him." Now he understood the fire in her eyes, the desperate will that had kept her alive. It was not just for herself. He felt a profound, aching respect for her. He looked over at the mantle, at the little wooden horse. "I had a son too," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. His name was Thomas. It was the first time he had spoken his son's name to another person in 5 years. Gorza looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. She did not offer empty words of comfort, she simply listened. He told her about Sarah and Thomas, about the fever that had swept through the valley one winter. He had been away, selling cattle in the main town. By the time he returned, it was too late. He spoke of the helplessness, the rage, and then the vast, crushing emptiness that had followed. "This ranch," he said, gesturing to the sturdy walls around them. It was all I had left of them. Working it. It was the only thing that made sense. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the only sound the shriek of the wind outside and the gentle hiss of the fire. A barrier had been broken between them. The shared space of the cabin was now filled with the weight of their shared griefs. It was a heavy burden, but it was one they now carried together. The winter began to recede, its grip on the land loosening. Patches of bare earth appeared on the south-facing slopes, and the days grew longer. A fragile sense of peace settled over the ranch. The routine they had established was comfortable, predictable. They worked, they ate, they shared the quiet evenings. He found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps in the morning. The silence of the house no longer felt like an absence. One afternoon, as they were repairing the roof of the barn, he saw a rider approaching from the east. It was the first visitor they had seen all winter. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. He looked at Gorza and saw the same tension in her face. She had already moved toward the shadows at the back of the barn. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. He climbed down the ladder and walked out to meet the rider. The man was dressed in the crisp, clean uniform of a private warden. He sat atop a fine black horse, his posture rigid, his face clean-shaven and severe. He had a cruel mouth and pale, cold eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Elias knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, who this was. "I am looking for escaped property," the man said, his voice clipped and arrogant. He did not dismount. "An orc female, tall, scarred, goes by the name Gorza. Have you seen her?" Elias kept his face impassive. "Haven't seen anyone all winter," he said. "The passes have been snowed in." The warden, Cale, surveyed the ranch with a proprietary air. His gaze lingered on the cabin, on the thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. "The snows are melting. Things that were lost are being found," he said, a veiled threat in his tone. "She is dangerous, and she is valuable. There is a bounty." "I'm not interested in bounties," Elias said, his hand resting on the handle of the axe he still carried. Cale's eyes narrowed. "A lone man like you, out here in the middle of nowhere. It would be a shame if something unfortunate were to happen to this nice little setup." The threat was no longer veiled. "I have a legal writ for her reclamation," Cale continued, tapping a rolled parchment at his saddle. "I'll be going into the town to deputize some men from the local garrison. I expect your full cooperation when I return." He wheeled his horse around without waiting for a reply and rode off, leaving a trail of churned mud in his wake. Elias stood there until the rider was a small dot on the horizon. The fragile peace had been shattered. He went back into the barn. Gorza stepped out of the shadows, her face grim. She had heard everything. "I will leave," she said, her voice strained. "He will not find me here." "Where will you go?" he asked. "He'll hunt you down." "That is not your concern," she said, her pride resurfacing, a defense against the fear in her eyes. "He threatened my home," Elias said, his voice quiet but hard as iron. "That makes it my concern." He walked past her and went into the cabin. He went to the mantelpiece and picked up the small wooden horse. He held it in his palm, the wood warm and familiar. For 5 years, he had done nothing but survive. He had maintained his fences, kept his world small and safe, and honored the dead by simply enduring. But that was not living. He looked at Gorza, who had followed him inside. He saw her strength, her resilience, her fierce determination to be reunited with her child. He saw a life that deserved to be lived, not hunted. In that moment, he made a choice. He was done building walls. It was time to defend what was inside them. He slipped the wooden horse into his coat pocket. "I'm going into town," he said. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." He saddled his own horse, a sturdy gray gelding, and rode hard for the town of Clearwater, a 2-hour ride away. The town was a small, dusty collection of buildings that served the surrounding ranches and farms. He bypassed the sheriff's office and went straight to the home of Dr. Hemlock. The doctor was an old man with kind, weary eyes who had known Elias his whole life. He had been the one to sign the death certificates for Sarah and Thomas. Elias found him in his office, smelling of antiseptic and pipe tobacco. He explained the situation quickly, without embellishment. He told him about Gorza, about the labor camp, and about Warden Kale. The doctor listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Elias was finished, Hemlock leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "This Kale," he said. "He represents a mining corporation with a government contract. His writ is likely legal, on paper." "I don't care if it's legal," Elias said. "It isn't right." The doctor nodded slowly. He looked at Elias, and for the first time in years, he saw something other than grief in the younger man's eyes. He saw purpose. "No," Hemlock agreed. "It is not right." He rummaged through a stack of dusty files on his desk and pulled out a thick, yellow document tied with a ribbon. "This is the original land grant for your property, from when the territory was first settled. Your great-grandfather's. It has some archaic clauses about sanctuary and the rights of the landowner that the corporation lawyers probably overlooked." He handed the document to Elias. "It might not be enough, but it might cause enough confusion to make that warden hesitate. Out here, the law is often what the man with the most conviction says it is." Elias took the document. "Thank you, Doc." "Be careful, Elias," the old man said. "Some things are worth fighting for. Just make sure you know what you're fighting for." "I do," Elias said, his hand instinctively going to the small shape of the wooden horse in his pocket. He rode back to the ranch, the land grant tucked safely inside his coat. He arrived to find Kale already there, just as he had promised. He had 2 men from the town with him, young deputies who looked uncomfortable and out of place. They were standing in the yard, and Kale was trying the cabin door, which was barred fast. "Elias," Kale said, a smug smile on his face. "Glad you could join us. I require you to open this door and turn over the fugitive." Elias dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. He walked until he was standing on the porch steps, between Kale and his front door. He was outnumbered, but he was on his own land. "She's not a fugitive," Elias said, his voice calm and steady. "She's under my protection." Kale laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your protection? You are harboring stolen property, rancher. That is a crime. Now stand aside." "According to the Clearwater Territorial Grant of 72, Elias said, pulling out the document Hemlock had given him, "the owner of this parcel of land has absolute authority over who and what resides within its borders. It grants the right of sanctuary." Kale's smile faltered. He looked at the old document, then back at Elias. "That's an antique. It won't hold up." "It will hold up long enough for me to send a rider to the territorial capital and file a formal challenge to your writ," Elias countered. "That could take months. I doubt your corporation wants to deal with that kind of delay." The 2 deputies shifted their feet, looking at each other. They were local boys. They knew Elias. They knew his story. This was getting more complicated than the simple reclamation job Kale had promised them. "This is nonsense," Kale snarled, losing his composure. "I have the law on my side." "The only law out here is what we can agree on," Elias said, his voice dropping lower. "And I don't agree on letting you take her." He took a step up, so he was looking down at the warden. "She is not property. She is a guest in my home. She's family." The word hung in the cold air, a declaration. As if summoned by the word, the cabin door unbarred and opened. Gorza stepped out onto the porch. She was holding the splitting axe, its blade clean and sharp. She did not raise it as a weapon. She held it loosely at her side, a statement of intent. She stood next to Elias, a silent, unshakable ally. The 2 of them, the grieving human and the escaped orc, stood together, a united front against the world. Kale looked from Elias's determined face to Gorza's fierce gaze, and then to his 2 wavering deputies. He saw that he had lost. He could not force the issue without violence, and the locals would not back him in a fight against one of their own. His authority, so absolute in the confines of his camp, was just a piece of paper out here. "This isn't over," he hissed, his face contorted with fury. "You will regret this." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, his anger a palpable force. The two deputies lingered for a moment. "Sorry, Elias," one of them muttered. "We were just following orders." Elias just nodded. They tipped their hats awkwardly and followed their employer, leaving Elias and Gorza alone in the sudden, profound quiet. The immediate danger was gone. They stood on the porch for a long moment, the tension slowly draining out of the air. He could feel the warmth of her shoulder near his. He turned and looked at her. The fire in her eyes was still there, but it was softer now, mingled with something he had never seen before. Gratitude. Trust. They went back inside. The cabin felt like a sanctuary again, a fortress that had held. The silence that fell between them was no longer awkward or watchful. It was a comfortable, shared silence, the kind that exists between people who have faced a threat together and won. "Kalen," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "my son, I have to find him." Elias looked at her, at this strong, proud woman who had endured so much. He thought of the long road ahead of her, the dangers she would face. He thought of his own empty, quiet life. The choice was clear. He had found something worth fighting for. He would not let it go. "We'll find him," he said. The single word made all the difference. Not you, we. A partnership had been forged in shared labor and a quiet understanding. A family had been declared on a wooden porch in the face of hatred. Now, a future was being planned. Spring arrived in earnest. The last of the snow melted away, revealing the rich, dark soil beneath. The world turned from white and gray to green and brown. They began to work the land for planting. He showed her how to plow the fields with the old mare, how to read the soil and know what to plant where. She, in turn, worked with a tireless strength that amazed him. Their days were filled with the rhythms of the earth, the hard, satisfying labor of creation. They talked more now, their conversations easy and unforced. She told him stories of her people, of mountains and deep forests, of songs and histories carved in stone. He told her about his parents, about growing up on this very land, about the dreams he and Sarah had shared for it. One day, as they were clearing stones from a new field, she unearthed a smooth, gray rock shaped like a heart. She held it for a moment, then passed it to him. "For Thomas," she said softly. He took it, its weight a solid, comforting presence in his hand. He placed it on the mantelpiece, right next to the wooden horse. The two objects sat side by side, symbols of a past that was cherished and a future that was being built. The house was no longer silent. It was quiet, but it was a living quiet, filled with the small sounds of their shared existence, the scrape of a chair, the murmur of conversation, the crackle of the evening fire. One evening, he sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the western ridges, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Gorza came and sat beside him, a warm mug of coffee in her hands. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. He felt the old ache in his chest, the familiar ghost of his loss, but it was different now. It was not a hollow void, but a space that had been filled with new memories, new purpose. He had found a woman stumbling and broken at the edge of his world. He had offered her shelter, and in return, she had offered him a reason to live again, not just to survive. He had learned that a family was not something you lost. It was something you built, day by day, with shared work, with quiet trust, and with the courage to stand together against the cold. The important parts of a life were not always the grand battles or the loud declarations. Sometimes they were as simple as a warm fire in a cold winter, a shared meal at a long table, and the promise of a new season of planting together.